Dominic Cole stepped into the towering glass lobby of the Sterling Group, a dense bundle of pristine white flowers cradled securely in his arms, and his 6-year-old son, Levi, pressed close against his damp jacket. Dominic was only covering an early morning shift, his clothes still smelling faintly of the cold autumn rain outside. Across the polished marble floor, CEO Violet Sterling paused, her sharp, calculating gaze sweeping over his worn leather shoes and the frayed cuffs of his jacket. With a cold, dismissive wave of her hand, she ordered security to remove him, making it entirely clear she did not tolerate unsolicited charity or disruptions in her building. But as the heavy-set security guard reached out to grab him, a thick ivory envelope slipped from the midnight blue silk ribbon binding the bouquet, fluttering down to land face up on the floor. Everything on Violet's face froze. On the back of the envelope was a distinct silver wax seal pressed into a shield shape she would recognize anywhere. Inside, a card written by her deceased father read, "Trust the man who carries these flowers. Do not look away, because that card is about to bring an empire to its knees before him." The alarm on Dominic's phone had gone off at exactly 5:15 that morning, just like every other day. He silenced the sharp beep before the second ring could echo through the cramped apartment, swinging his legs off the worn couch that served as his bed. He stood still in the dark for a moment, listening intently for any sound from the small bedroom down the hall. Nothing but steady, rhythmic breathing. Levi was still asleep. He had another hour before he needed to wake the boy for school. Dominic moved quietly into the tiny kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath his bare feet, and started the coffee maker. While the machine hissed and dripped, he reached up and pulled down the faded white envelope he kept taped to the inside of the cabinet door. He slipped the bills out and counted them for the third time this week, $43. Rent was due on Friday, and today was already Tuesday. He had already pulled one grueling double shift at Petals and Green, the local flower shop, and was scheduled for another on Thursday morning. But Thursday felt an eternity away when $43 was all that stood between his son and the street. He carefully hid the envelope away and began preparing Levi's breakfast. He scrambled 2 eggs, toasted the last slices of store-brand bread, and poured the remaining orange juice into a plastic glass, stretching it thin with a splash of water. Levi never complained, and Dominic had long since forced himself to swallow the guilt of a father who couldn't provide the best. The boy ate whatever was placed in front of him with a quiet maturity that broke Dominic's heart just as much as it swelled it with pride. The phone rang at 6:42 a.m., vibrating violently against the counter. It was Marcus, the owner of Petals and Green. His voice sounded frantic and hoarse over the line. Derek had called out sick with the flu, and a high-priority, prepaid order needed to be delivered to the Sterling Group Tower, downtown, before 9 a.m. Marcus explained that the client who had originally placed the order passed away over a year ago, but his estate attorney had strict instructions to trigger the delivery on this exact date. Dominic looked at the clock, then at Levi's bedroom door. He had no sitter, no neighbor available on short notice, and no choice. He told Marcus he would take the job, but he would have to bring his son along. The bouquet was unlike anything Dominic had handled at the shop. It was a massive, tightly packed arrangement of rare white blossoms, tied with a heavy midnight blue ribbon. Tucked perfectly into the center of the knot was that ivory envelope, sealed with the heavy, mysterious silver wax shield. It felt remarkably heavy in Dominic's hands, carrying a strange, almost tangible weight. By the time they reached the downtown financial district, the rain was pouring sideways. Dominic shielded the flowers under his jacket, holding Levi's small, cold hand tightly as they navigated the slick sidewalks. Levi clutched his favorite toy, a faded red toy car missing its back wheel deep inside his coat pocket, keeping his eyes glued to the towering skyscrapers above. Inside the warmth of the Sterling Group lobby, the atmosphere was suffocatingly elite. The receptionists looked at Dominic's damp clothes and made an instant, unspoken judgment. When Dominic requested to see Violet Sterling directly, citing the strict delivery instructions, the lead security officer, Mason Reed, stepped into his path, his broad frame casting a long shadow. Just then, the executive elevator opened. Violet Sterling stepped out, flanked by her CFO, Connor Blake, and her personal assistant, Hannah Price. Violet moved with an intimidating, icy authority that demanded absolute submission from the room. She didn't have time for a delivery man. She didn't care about flowers, but as she coldly commanded Mason to throw them out, the ivory envelope fell. Violet stared at the silver wax seal on the marble floor, her breath catching sharply in her throat. The arrogant smile on Connor Blake's face instantly vanished as the entire lobby fell into a breathless, terrifying silence. The heavy silence stretched across the vast marble expanse of the lobby, so absolute that the steady drumming of the rain against the exterior glass seemed to amplify. Violet Sterling did not move. Her eyes were locked onto the silver shield pressed into the wax, a symbol she had not seen since the day they buried her father, Charles Sterling, 14 months ago. It was the private seal he used only for documents of absolute importance, the ones he kept locked away from board members, lawyers, and even her. Before Mason Reed could react or step away, 6-year-old Levi moved. With the quiet, unbothered grace of a child unaware of the corporate tension suffocating the adults around him, he dropped to his knees. His small, wet sneaker squeaked against the pristine floor as he scooped up the thick ivory envelope. He wiped a smudge of rainwater from the surface with his sleeve, then turned and held it up, not to his father, but directly toward Violet. "You dropped this, lady," Levi said, his voice small but perfectly clear in the cavernous space. "My dad said we have to be careful with it." Violet looked down at the boy. For a fleeting second, the fierce, unyielding armor she wore every day as the head of a multi-million-dollar conglomerate seemed to crack. Her fingers trembled imperceptibly as she reached out and took the envelope from his hand. The paper was heavy, expensive cotton stock, completely dry despite the storm outside. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat before her professional mask snapped back into place. Connor Blake stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit, a thin, patronizing smile returning to his lips. "Violet, let's be rational here. This is a public lobby. Anyone could have found a way to mimic your father's old seal. There are corporate espionage groups, disgruntled former contractors, or frankly, just desperate people looking for a handout who know how to play on your grief. Security should handle this immediately so we aren't late for the briefing." Violet didn't look at Connor. She slipped her thumb under the silver wax, breaking it with a crisp, clean snap. She slid the single sheet of paper out and unfolded it. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable, the sharp, left-leaning slant, the heavy pressure on the downward strokes. "Violet," the note read. "If you're still angry with me, stay angry for later. But right now, trust the man who carries these flowers. Do not look away, because this man holds the missing piece of the puzzle, and he is about to bring an empire to its knees." A chill traveled down Violet's spine. She folded the note carefully, pressing it into her palm, and turned her gaze to Dominic. He stood there, completely unfazed by Connor's insults or the intense scrutiny of the security team. He wasn't shifting his weight nervously. He wasn't trying to explain himself. He simply stood with a quiet, grounded masculinity, one hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder, waiting for her to make her move. "Who are you?" Violet asked, her voice dropping to a demanding, steady register. "And how did you come into possession of this?" "My name is Dominic Cole," he replied, his tone even and calm, contrasting sharply with the chaotic energy of the room. "I don't know what's written on that paper, Miss Sterling. I'm a delivery driver for Petals and Green. The owner told me this was a prepaid, time-sensitive delivery that had to be handed to you personally before 9 o'clock. I'm just doing my job." Connor chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "A part-time florist carrying a dead man's decree? Violet, this is absurd. Look at him. Look at the kid. It's a setup." Levi looked up at Connor, his brow furrowing. He pulled his hand out of his jacket pocket, still holding his broken red toy car, and stepped slightly in front of Dominic. "My dad doesn't tell lies," the boy said stoutly, his defensive maternal instinct kicking in. "And he doesn't open other people's mail. Even when we only have $43 left in the kitchen cabinet, he says the truth is the only thing we actually own." The blunt honesty of the child hit the room like a physical blow. Hannah Price, standing just behind Violet, let out a soft, sharp breath, her eyes widening as she looked at Dominic with a sudden, deep curiosity. Violet felt a sudden, heavy pressure in her chest. She looked at the worn soles of Dominic's shoes, then at the absolute, unwavering integrity in his eyes. He wasn't begging. He wasn't asking for money. He was a father standing tall in front of his son, refusing to be lessened by the wealth around him. "Hannah," Violet ordered, never taking her eyes off Dominic. "Take Mr. Cole and his son to the private executive lounge on the 4th floor. Get the boy whatever he wants to eat or drink. Make sure they are comfortable." "Violet, the board meeting is in less than 2 hours, Connor warned, his tone losing its warmth. "We don't have time for distractions. I will decide what is a distraction, Connor, Violet said coldly, turning her back on him. She looked at Dominic one last time. I will be up shortly, Mr. Cole. Don't leave. Dominic nodded once, a respectful, measured gesture. We'll be there. The executive lounge on the fourth floor was entirely soundproofed against the frantic hum of the floors below. Large glass windows looked out over the rain-slicked city streets, where the headlights of morning traffic blurred into long ribbons of yellow and red. Hannah Price had done exactly as she was told, bringing a small platter of fresh fruit, a glass of apple juice, and a heavy white sketch pad with a set of fine-tipped pens for Levi. The boy sat at a low mahogany coffee table, entirely absorbed in his task. He placed his broken red toy car right at the edge of the paper, using it as a model while he carefully drew a flatbed trailer towing a line of sleek, futuristic vehicles. Dominic sat in one of the oversized leather armchairs, his posture relaxed but alert. He hadn't touched the coffee Hannah had poured for him. He was watching his son, his thumb gently smoothing out a fraying thread on his jacket sleeve. When the heavy glass door clicked open, Violet Sterling stepped inside. She had left her structured blazer at her desk, wearing only her silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back into a tight, severe knot. She looked sharp, intimidating, and entirely out of place in a room meant for relaxation. She sat across from him, placing the folded note from her father directly onto the table between them. She studied Dominic's face for several long seconds, looking for a tell, a hint of greed, or the practiced look of a con artist. She found none of it. "Tell me about the night you met my father," Violet said, her voice dropping the sharp edge she used in the boardroom, replacing it with a raw, intense focus. He didn't make mistakes about people. "If he sent you to me today, of all days, there is a reason. I want to know exactly what happened." Dominic looked down at the note, then back up at her. His gray eyes were steady. "It was 3 years ago," he began, his voice deep and unhurried. "A Tuesday night, much like this one, pouring rain. Levi was 3 years old at the time, and he had a terrifyingly high fever. I was driving down Hadley Road, trying to get him to the urgent care clinic before his throat closed up from a severe infection. The visibility was near zero." Violet leaned in slightly, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of her seat. "I saw a luxury sedan stopped at an awkward angle against the curb." Dominic continued, his tone carrying the weight of the memory. The hazard lights were blinking faintly. An elderly man was standing out in the freezing downpour without a coat, staring helplessly at the front tire. It had blown out completely after he sideswiped a concrete barrier, and the impact had tripped an emergency fuel cutoff switch in the engine. He didn't know how to reset it, and he was shivering violently. He wasn't physically hurt, but he was completely shaken. The kind of deep, silent panic that hits older men when they realize their wealth can't stop the cold. "And you stopped?" Violet asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Even with your son sick in the back seat?" "I didn't want to," Dominic admitted honestly. "I was terrified for Levi, but I looked at that man, and I knew if I left him there, he might not make it through the night in that storm. I pulled over. I got him out of the rain and into the front seat of my truck. I gave him my own jacket to stop the shivering, and I sat in the back with Levi, holding him close to keep him warm while we waited for an emergency transport. I called the clinic ahead to let them know we were delayed, and I just talked to your father. I didn't ask his name, I didn't care who he was. I just spoke to him the way I speak to my son when he's scared of a thunderstorm, steady, slow, and certain." Dominic paused, a faint smile touching his lips as he glanced at Levi. "When the tow truck finally arrived, I helped the driver clear the road and guide the traffic safely around the bend so no one else would crash. Before your father got into the cab of the truck, he gripped my hand so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked me dead in the eye and said, 'One day, what you are will come back to you.' I thought it was just an old man's gratitude. I never saw him again." Violet's hands were trembling now. She recognized the story. Her father had returned home that night drenched, wearing a faded, generic canvas jacket that he refused to throw away, keeping it locked in his private closet until the day he died. He had told her someone saved his life, but he had never given her a name. "He looked for you," Violet said, her voice cracking slightly before she forced it back into compliance. "My father was a logistics genius. He tracked down every detail that mattered to him. If he didn't reach out to you directly, it was to protect you from whatever he was fighting inside this building." She leaned closer, her business instincts overriding her emotion. "The note says, you hold the missing piece. Dominic, what did you do before you worked at the flower shop?" Dominic shifted slightly, his quiet masculinity filling the space between them. I was an operations engineer. I ran route efficiency and cold chain compliance analysis for Meridian Freight Solutions for 5 years. Violet froze. Meridian was our primary subcontractor for the entire mid-Atlantic shipping corridor. I know, Dominic said quietly. And 3 years ago, I was handed a performance summary for those exact routes. Management wanted me to sign off on a massive expansion of billing hours and fuel allocations. They wanted me to certify that the refrigerated trailers were running at peak capacity through the network. But when I audited the digital routing logs, the numbers didn't make sense. The volume they claimed to be moving was physically impossible for the fleet size they operated. Someone was fabricating hundreds of thousands of dollars in operating losses and charging them back to the primary client. To Sterling Group, Violet realized, the blood draining from her face. I refused to sign the compliance report, Dominic said. I told them it was a blatant fraud. Within 48 hours, my security credentials were revoked, my files were purged, and I was blacklisted from the entire logistics sector. I couldn't get a job anywhere near an airfield or a shipping dock. That's how I ended up at Petals and Green. Before Violet could speak, the lounge door burst open. Hannah Price stepped inside, her face pale, holding a tablet tightly against her chest. She looked completely overwhelmed, her eyes jumping from Violet to Dominic. "Violet," Hannah gasped, trying to catch her breath. "I did exactly what you asked. I bypassed the standard executive server and pulled the deep archive logs from 3 years ago. The compliance report Dominic is talking about, it exists. It was buried under a level 5 security clearance." "Who authorized the burial, Hannah?" Violet demanded, her voice cutting through the room like ice. Hannah looked out the glass window toward the upper floors where the boardroom sat. The suppression order was signed by Connor Blake. And the corporate entity that bought out Meridian Freight Solutions right after Dominic was fired is a shell company owned entirely by Arcturus Capital Partners. The exact investment firm Connor is trying to sell our operational control to in less than an hour. The entire room seemed to drop in temperature. The betrayal was absolute, structured, and deep. Levi stopped drawing. He dropped his pen, the soft plastic clicking against the wood table. He looked up at his father, his large, innocent eyes taking in the pale, frightened expression on the wealthy CEO's face and the tense set of his father's jaw. He reached out, his small hand tugging gently at the sleeve of Dominic's stamped jacket. "Dad," Levi whispered, his small voice cutting through the heavy adult silence of the room. "Are they mad at us? If they don't believe you about the numbers, do we have to apologize for bringing the flowers here?" Dominic's expression instantly melted. The hardened, defensive posture of a blacklisted engineer vanished as he reached down, picking his son up effortlessly and settling him onto his lap. He wrapped his strong arms around the boy, pressing his chin against Levi's soft hair. "No, buddy," Dominic said, his voice incredibly warm, steady, and full of an absolute safety that money could never buy. "We never apologize for telling the truth. We told the truth, we delivered our flowers, and whatever these people decide to do with it now is up to them." Violet watched the exchange, her breath hitching in her throat. She had hundreds of millions of dollars, absolute authority over thousands of employees, and the power to command rooms with a single word. Yet, looking at this man in his faded jacket, holding his son with an effortless, unshakable peace in the middle of a corporate war zone, she realized she had absolutely nothing at all. Her hands shook as she picked up her father's note again. "Mr. Cole," Violet said, standing up, her eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce resolve. "The board meeting starts in exactly 15 minutes. My father wanted me to trust you. I need you to come with me to the 36th floor. It's time to show them exactly what kind of empire they've been trying to steal." The elevator ride up to the 36th floor was entirely silent. Hannah held her tablet tightly against her chest, her fingers frantically running a script to pull up the encrypted legacy files she had managed to unearth from the deep archive. Violet stood perfectly rigid, staring at the polished metal doors, her reflection looking fractured and tense. Beside her, Dominic held Levi by the hand. The boy was still clutching his small red toy car, completely fascinated by the smooth, quiet speed of the executive elevator, as the floor numbers flashed rapidly overhead. When the doors parted, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the executive suite pressed in immediately. The main boardroom was a massive capsule of steel and curved glass, overlooking the sprawling skyline of the city. Inside, 12 board members sat around a polished mahogany table that stretched 30 feet. At the head of the room stood Connor Blake, gesturing smoothly toward a massive digital projection displaying a sea of bleeding red financial charts. Which brings us to the final projection, Connor's voice carried through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with practiced confidence. Our shipping infrastructure in the Mid-Atlantic corridor is completely compromised. These operating losses are no longer sustainable. If we do not approve the immediate transition of operational control to Arcturus Capital Partners today, the Sterling Group faces severe insolvency within the fiscal year. The numbers do not lie. Let me know. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid open with a soft whisper. Violet walked into the room first, her stride purposeful and aggressive. But the moment the board members looked past her, a collective murmur of confusion and disapproval rippled through the air. Dominic walked in right behind her, his worn canvas jacket still damp from the storm, his heavy work boots leaving faint wet prints on the plush designer carpeting. Levi followed closely, holding his father's hand tightly, his wide eyes scanning the room of stern, older faces dressed in thousands of dollars of custom tailoring. Connor Blake stopped mid-sentence. His eyes snapped to Dominic, and a flash of irritation crossed his face before he smoothly covered it with a sharp, mocking laugh. "Violet, what is the meaning of this?" Connor asked, spreading his hands wide as if appealing to the board. "We are in the middle of a critical vote that determines the future of this entire conglomerate. Why have you brought a delivery boy and his child into a closed executive session? Has security completely lost control of the building?" An older woman with sharp silver hair and an impeccable tailored suit, Margaret Ashby, leaned forward, her brow furrowing deeply as she tapped her gold pen against the table. "Violet, this is highly unusual. We are discussing highly sensitive, confidential corporate data." "Who is this man?" "This man," Violet said, her voice echoing clearly off the glass walls, "is the reason this company still has a future. This is Dominic Cole. 3 years ago, he was the lead operations engineer for our primary subcontractor, Meridian Freight." Connor's smile didn't fade, but his jaw tightened. He clicked his presentation remote, turning off the glowing red charts and replacing them with the corporate logo of the Sterling Group. "An operations engineer? Violet, please. Look at him. He's a part-time florist running errands in the rain. If he ever worked in logistics, he clearly couldn't handle the pressure. This boardroom is for the standard of excellence your father built, not for collecting charity cases off the street." He walked around the massive table, stopping just a few feet from Dominic. Connor leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension, intentionally speaking loud enough for every board member to hear. "Tell me, Mr. Cole, did you lose your way to the loading dock? Or are you hoping that by bringing your kid here and looking pathetic, we'll throw a few extra dollars into your tip jar? This is a multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring. You don't belong in this room. You don't even belong on this floor." A few of the younger board members chuckled softly, adjusting their ties and looking away. The public humiliation was deliberate, designed to crush Dominic's dignity and make Violet look completely reckless for bringing him into the room. But Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't lower his gaze, and his posture didn't change. He stood with that same quiet, unyielding masculinity that had completely anchored the lounge downstairs. He looked down at Connor, his gray eyes completely cool, reflecting absolutely no fear or anger. "Hannah," Violet cut through the sneers, her voice trembling slightly with an anger she was struggling to contain. "Set Levi up in the glass-walled corridor just outside. Give him his drawing pad." Dominic knelt down, completely ignoring Connor's presence. He looked at his son, his face softening completely, a world away from the hostility of the corporate sharks around them. "Hey, buddy, see that glass window right there? Go sit with Hannah for a minute. Draw me a big truck. I can see you the whole time, okay?" Levi looked at the angry faces in the room, then back at his dad. He nodded quietly, sliding his red toy car into his pocket, and walked out to the corridor with Hannah. He sat on a sleek leather bench, pressing his face briefly against the glass to wave at his father before opening his sketch pad. Dominic stood back up, turning his full attention to the presentation screen. The quiet, gentle father was gone. In his place stood a man of immense hidden intelligence, completely grounded in his reality. "You're right about one thing, Mr. Blake," Dominic said, his deep voice carrying a terrifyingly steady weight that immediately silenced the whispers in the room. "The numbers don't lie." But the person entering them certainly did. He walked past Connor, completely ignoring the CFO's attempt to block him, and walked right up to the interactive display system at the front of the boardroom. He didn't hesitate for a second. His fingers moved across the interface with an effortless, practiced familiarity, bypassing the polished summary screens and diving straight into the raw, unedited Mid-Atlantic routing codes. "Look at column 8 through 11 on your operational loss sheet," Dominic said, pointing directly to a string of encrypted data. "You've coded these as extreme fuel and maintenance overhead from the regional distribution center in the Mid-Atlantic. You're claiming the refrigerated trailers were running at full capacity but losing money due to supply chain disruption penalties." Connor's face went completely rigid. "This is highly proprietary data. You have no authority to touch that console." "I don't need authority to read a fraud I exposed 3 years ago," Dominic countered, his voice dropping an octave, completely commanding the room. "These exact route codes belong to a fleet that physically didn't have the rolling stock to move this volume. You are billing the Sterling Group for hundreds of ghost trips that never happened, funneling the money directly into a subcontractor that you secretly purchased through Arcturus Capital Partners." Margaret Ashby stood up, her eyes wide as she looked from the screen to the trembling CFO. "Connor, is this true?" Connor slammed his hand down on the mahogany table, his sophisticated facade completely shattering. "This is an outrageous lie from a desperate blacklisted failure who was fired for incompetence. He has no proof, no standing, and no records." At that exact moment, the lights in the boardroom flickered violently, and a sharp, red emergency warning banner flashed across the top of the main display screen. The automated operational grid for the entire Eastern Transit network had just gone into a hard lockdown. The boardroom exploded into absolute chaos as the piercing wail of a high-frequency emergency siren echoed through the vents. The recessed overhead lighting cut out instantly, replaced by the rhythmic, aggressive pulse of crimson hazard lights that painted the mahogany table blood red. On the main display, the network map of the entire Eastern Transit grid began to blink erratically, dozens of shipping routes turning from green to a flashing, ominous black. "What did you do?" Connor Blake shouted, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at Dominic. "He hacked the terminal! He's sabotaging the network to cover up his own lies! Security, get in here right now!" "Shut up, Connor!" Violet snapped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw herself toward the main console, her fingers flying over the glass interface, but the screen was completely frozen, displaying a massive, pulsing padlock icon. The primary automated hub in Philadelphia is dropping offline. The cold chain transport trailers are losing power grid connection. We have over $80 million worth of temperature-sensitive medical supplies and perishable cargo locked in transit right now. If those compressors stay down for more than 10 minutes, the entire distribution network collapses. The board members panicked, scraping their chairs backward, shouting over one another, completely helpless in the face of a systemic catastrophe. But outside the glass-walled corridor, a far more critical emergency was unfolding. The automated safety systems of the Sterling Group Tower had detected the network lockdown as a potential hostile breach. Slowly, heavily, the thick, motorized fire isolation shutters began to descend from the ceiling, designed to seal off the executive boardroom from the rest of the floor. Through the thick glass, Dominic saw his son. The sudden, violent blare of the sirens and the flashing red lights had completely shattered 6-year-old Levi's composure. The boy dropped his drawing pad, his small frame trembling violently as he rushed toward the glass partition. He pounded his small fists against the reinforced pane, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks, clutching his broken red toy car like a lifeline as the massive steel shutter crept lower and lower, threatening to cut him off from his father completely. Hannah Price was on her knees beside him, her hands hovering in the air, completely panicked and unable to calm the screaming child. Violet turned and saw the boy. For all her ruthless corporate power, for all her ability to command hundreds of millions of dollars in a negotiation, she had never encountered genuine, raw, human terror. The sight of the weeping child trapped behind the closing steel barrier paralyzed her. Her breath hitched, her hands began to shake uncontrollably, and the icy control she prided herself on vanished completely. She looked at the blinking red screens, then at the crying boy, entirely suffocated by the pressure. She didn't know how to fix the network, and she didn't know how to save the child. She was completely, utterly helpless. When everyone else froze, Dominic Cole became a rock. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He walked across the frantic boardroom with a quiet, terrifyingly steady stride that seemed to anchor the very air in the room. He bypassed the hysterical board members, stepped up to the secondary auxiliary environmental station near. He didn't need a complex engineering lecture to understand what was happening. He saw the physical danger. He felt the emotional urgency. And he acted. Dominic reached into the exposed wiring harness, his calloused fingers instantly isolating the thick blue command line for the emergency shutters. With a calm, precise jerk, he severed the line. The heavy steel shutter stopped with a loud, mechanical clunk, hovering exactly 3 feet off the ground, leaving a wide open gap to the corridor. Dominic dropped to his knees in the opening, completely ignoring the flashing red alarms. He slid half his body under the shutter, extending his strong, steady arms toward his frantic son. "Levi," Dominic said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a deep, unshakable warmth that bypassed the screeching sirens entirely. It was the exact same tone he used when the rent envelope was empty, or when the storms rattled their apartment windows. "Look at me, buddy. Look right at my eyes." Levi stopped pounding on the glass. He blinked through his tears, his small chest heaving as he looked down at his father's calm, unhurried face. "You're safe, son," Dominic said, offering a soft, confident smile. "The loud noises are just the building's computers throwing a tantrum because they don't know how to do their jobs. But I know how to fix them. I need you to climb under here and hold onto my jacket. Can you do that for me?" Instantly, the boy's panic receded. The absolute trust he placed in his father overrode every ounce of fear. Levi wiped his nose with his sleeve, nodded bravely, and crawled under the stalled shutter, throwing his small arms tightly around Dominic's neck. Dominic scooped him up effortlessly, standing back up and resting the boy securely against his broad chest. Levi buried his face in Dominic's shoulder, his breathing instantly slowing, completely protected. Violet watched the entire sequence in breathless silence, her trembling hands pressed against her mouth. Power could buy a skyscraper, but it couldn't buy the absolute emotional security this man gave his child without even trying. Dominic turned around, holding his sleeping, calmed son with one arm, and walked back to the primary terminal where the board members were still arguing in despair. "This isn't a random system glitch, Miss Sterling," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the panic like a razor, "and it's not a hack from the outside. This is a hard-coded internal kill switch." Connor Blake backed away from the table, his face slick with sweat. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're a trespasser." "I designed the original architecture for this transit grid before you blacklisted me," Dominic said, his gray eyes pinning Connor to the wall. "This lockdown was manually triggered from an executive account right here in this room. Someone realized the deep audit was pulling up the fraudulent billing records from 3 years ago, and they deployed a wipe command to delete the evidence before the board could vote." Dominic stepped up to the main terminal console, his single free hand hovering over the locked interface. "The system is wiping the Mid-Atlantic servers as we speak," Dominic announced, looking directly at Violet. "In exactly 2 minutes, the fraudulent records will be gone forever, and your transit grid will be permanently disabled. I can bypass the kill switch and reverse the lockdown, but it requires an administrative master override code that only one person in the history of this company ever held." Violet's eyes widened. "My father. He gave it to me the night I saved his life," Dominic said quietly, "and it's time to use it." The countdown on the primary display was a jagged, bleeding digital clock ticking backward from 90 seconds. 90 seconds until the entire operational history of the Mid-Atlantic Logistics Network was permanently erased, taking Connor Blake's multi-million-dollar fraud into the digital grave with it. The crimson emergency lights continued to pulse against the glass walls, casting a rhythmic, bloody hue over the terrified faces of the Sterling Group board. "Violet, look at what you're allowing!" Connor screamed, his pristine silk tie pulled loose at his collar, his forehead slick with a cold sweat that broke through his expensive bronzer. "You are letting an unverified, disgruntled vagrant touch the master terminal of a critical infrastructure company. If he inputs a corrupt string, the entire automated grid goes dark permanently. Mason! Where is security?" "Mason is waiting on my orders, Connor," Violet said, her voice cutting through his panicked shouting with an icy, razor-sharp precision. She stepped directly between Connor and the console, her heels anchoring her to the floor. The trembling in her hands had completely disappeared, replaced by a sudden, fierce clarity. She looked at Dominic, who stood entirely steady, holding his 6-year-old son securely against his shoulder. "Do it, Dominic." Dominic did not hesitate. With his right arm cradling Levi, whose small hands were still locked tightly around his father's neck, Dominic extended his left hand toward the flashing terminal. The screen was a chaotic mess of scrolling error logs and systemic lockouts, demanding a 24-character alphanumeric administrative override key that had not been active in the system for over a decade. Connor took a desperate step forward, his hand reaching out to physically tear Dominic away from the glass interface. I will not let you destroy this company. Touch him, Connor, and I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your natural life in a federal penitentiary before the sun sets today, Violet barked, her eyes flashing with a lethal intensity that made the older CFO freeze in his tracks. Dominic's fingers moved across the glass panel with an effortless, fluid rhythm. He didn't look at the keys. He looked at the scrolling data, his eyes tracking the code as if reading a familiar book. He remembered the cold, rainy night inside his truck, the older man shivering under his canvas jacket, scribbling a sequence of numbers and letters on the back of a faded receipt. Charles Sterling had told him that night, "If the house I built ever catches fire from the inside, type this into the foundation. It will blow the walls off." Dominic pressed the final strike key. The frantic, piercing wail of the siren cut out instantly. The aggressive red hazard lights flickered twice and died, replaced immediately by the bright, clean, standard overhead illumination of the boardroom. The sudden brightness made several board members blink in astonishment. The scrolling red countdown clock vanished, replaced by a deep, oceanic blue screen that began to rapidly reinitialize every transit line from New York to Virginia. A collective, massive sigh of relief rippled through the room as the main display map turned completely green. The cold chain transport compressors kicked back in, saving $80 million in cargo in a matter of seconds. But the master override did not stop there. Because it was a deep-layer administrative command designed by Charles Sterling himself, the code bypassed every single firewall, encryption block, and hidden partition that Connor Blake had established over the last 5 years. The blue screen suddenly split into dozens of cascading windows, projecting thousands of internal unredacted emails, double-entry ledger sheets, and wire transfer receipts directly onto the massive 30-foot boardroom wall. At the very top of the screen, in bold, undeniable text, the system displayed the true corporate registry of Arcturus Capital Partners. The ultimate beneficiary owner listed on the official banking documents, holding a 90% stake in the shell company that had been systematically draining the Sterling Group's profits, was Connor Blake. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs right after a devastating explosion. Margaret Ashby stood up slowly, her gold pen snapping cleanly between her fingers. She stared at the wall of evidence, her face turning an ash gray as she looked at the man she had trusted with the company's finances for a decade. $42 million, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with an immense, boiling rage. You didn't just mismanage the corridor, Connor. You were bleeding us dry from the inside out. You tried to force a sale to your own shell company to steal the entire empire from Charles's daughter. Connor's face went entirely white. He looked at the wall, then at the board members who were now looking at him with utter disgust, and finally at Dominic. The arrogant, untouchable executive was entirely gone. He looked small, broken, and completely hollowed out. This is an illegal breach of privacy. Connor stammered, his hands shaking violently as he tried to gather his leather folders from the table. None of this is admissible. I'm leaving. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom slid open completely. Mason Reed stepped into the room, flanked by 3 uniformed Metropolitan police officers who had been escorted up via the private express elevator on Violet's direct command. Violet didn't look at Connor as she pointed toward the door. Mr. Blake is leaving, Mason. Please ensure he is escorted directly to the police cruiser waiting in the lower loading dock. Give his files to the authorities. As the officers stepped forward and locked the silver handcuffs around Connor's wrists, the disgraced CFO let out a pathetic, choked sound, his custom shoes shuffling uselessly against the carpet as he was dragged out of the room in front of the entire assembly. Dominic stood perfectly still at the front of the room, completely detached from the corporate execution that had just taken place. He adjusted Levi slightly on his hip. The boy popped his head up from his father's shoulder, looking around the brightly lit room, then down at the screen. Are the computers happy now, Dad? Levi asked into the quiet room. Dominic smiled softly, his tired eyes crinkling at the corners. Yeah, buddy. The computers are finally telling the truth. The remaining members of the board sat in stunned, breathless silence, staring at the cascading walls of digital evidence that still painted the room in an ocean of blue light. The threat that had menaced the Sterling Group for years had been excised in a matter of minutes, not by a high-priced crisis management firm or a team of corporate attorneys, but by a man in a damp canvas jacket holding a child. Margaret Ashby was the first to break the stillness. She stood up, her sharp gray eyes fixed entirely on Dominic. The severe, judgmental expression she had worn when he first entered the room was completely gone, replaced by a deep, humbling respect. "Mr. Cole," Margaret said, her voice carrying a rare warmth that the boardroom hadn't heard in years. "3 years ago, this company owed you a debt of absolute gratitude. Instead, we allowed a corrupt executive to strip you of your career, your reputation, and your livelihood. You had every reason to watch this network burn to the ground today. Yet, you stepped under a failing shutter and saved us anyway. On behalf of the entire board of directors, I offer you our deepest, most profound apologies." A murmur of firm agreement passed around the table. Several older executives nodded, looking down at their own hands, suddenly ashamed of the way they had sneered at Dominic's worn boots just an hour prior. Dominic adjusted Levi on his hip, the boy's head resting peacefully against his collarbone. He looked at the assembly of wealthy, powerful individuals and didn't show a hint of arrogance or triumph. His quiet masculinity remained entirely unshaken. "I didn't do it to save your network, ma'am," Dominic said, his deep voice calm and even. "I did it because 3 years ago I made a promise to myself that I wouldn't let a lie stand if I had the power to correct it. And today, my son was in this building. I don't ever want him to see his father walk away from the truth just because the room is hostile." Violet Sterling stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Dominic. The icy, unyielding armor she had worn like a shield since her father's passing had completely dissolved. She looked at the man standing before her, a man who possessed nothing of the corporate world's superficial wealth, yet carried an entirely superior kind of power. A deep, magnetic pull of security and warmth radiated from him, and for the first time in her life, Violet felt a profound, aching vulnerability. She had everything money could buy, yet standing near him, she realized she had spent years living without a single moment of genuine peace. "Margaret," Violet said, her voice steady but carrying a soft, emotional weight. "Please handle the formal recess of the board. Hannah, ensure the legal team hands over all of Connor's decrypted files to the federal authorities immediately. I will be downstairs." Without waiting for a response, Violet walked toward the glass doors, pausing just long enough to look at Dominic. "Come with me, Mr. Cole, please." They rode the executive elevator down to the main lobby in a quiet that felt entirely different from before. The tension was no longer born of danger, but of a growing, unvoiced chemistry between two entirely opposite worlds. When the doors opened into the massive marble space, the lobby was running smoothly again. The staff at the reception desk looked up, their faces immediately freezing as they saw the CEO walking side by side with the delivery man they had tried to throw out into the rain. Violet stopped in the center of the polished floor, right where the ivory envelope had fallen earlier that morning. She turned to face Dominic, ignoring the whispers and the curious glances of her employees. Her hands, usually so controlled, trembled slightly as she clasped them together. "I owe you a personal apology, Dominic," she said, using his first name for the very first time. The transition from formal business to raw, human sincerity was undeniable. "This morning I looked at your clothes, I looked at your job, and I judged you by everything that didn't matter. I made a fast, arrogant decision, and I was entirely wrong. I am so deeply sorry." Dominic looked down at her. The distance between them was mere inches, and the sharp contrast between her elite silk attire and his rugged, hard-working frame only heightened the intensity of the moment. His gray eyes softened as he took in the genuine remorse on her beautiful, tired face. "I accept your apology, Violet," Dominic said softly, his voice a low rumble that seemed to anchor her spinning world. "But the debt you owe isn't to me. The bigger debt is to the next person who walks through those revolving doors in a wet jacket, carrying something real to say. If you change anything in this empire your father built, start by changing the way you look at the people who don't look expensive enough to matter." Violet felt a sharp, sweet ache in her chest as he spoke. He wasn't asking her for a reward. He wasn't trying to exploit her guilt. He was simply teaching her how to be human again. Levi stirred against Dominic's shoulder, his long eyelashes fluttering open as he woke from his nap. He rubbed his eyes with a small fist, still clutching his broken red toy car, and looked blinking at Violet. "Is the bad man gone?" Levi asked in a sleepy, innocent voice. Violet's face melted into a genuine, breathtaking smile. She stepped closer, her hand moving instinctively toward the boy, her fingers brushing gently against his soft hair. "Yes, buddy, the bad man is gone. Your dad saved the whole day." Levi looked at her hand, then up at her face, his child's intuition sensing the deep change in her energy. My dad always saves the day. If you don't have anyone to save your day, you can walk to the bus stop with us. We have a big umbrella. Violet's breath caught in her throat, a sudden wave of emotion threatening to break through her public composure. She looked up from the boy, her eyes meeting Dominic's in a long, silent gaze filled with an unspoken, powerful tension. I would like that very much, Violet whispered, her voice laced with a hidden meaning that traveled straight to Dominic's core. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her professional footing while her heart raced. But before we walk anywhere, Dominic, your original engineering file has already been wiped clean of any blacklisting. Your name is being restored to the industry ledger with full executive honors today. And I want to officially offer you a position as our Chief of Logistics Operations at a premium salary befitting the man who saved this conglomerate. Dominic looked at her for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching between them like a fragile cord. Dominic looked at her for a long, heavy moment, the silence stretching between them in the center of the bustling lobby. The glass doors behind him caught the shifting light of the storm outside, casting a cool gray hue over his sharp features. I appreciate the scale of what you're offering, Violet, Dominic said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, protective weight. And I appreciate that you're trying to set things right, but I'm going to say, not yet. Violet blinked, entirely caught off guard. In her world, no one turned down a corporate title, let alone a premium executive salary. Not yet? I spent the last 3 years stepping away from the corporate machinery to make sure I could raise my son with absolute clarity about what matters, Dominic explained, his eyes dropping briefly to Levi before returning to hers. I won't sacrifice that peace or his stability for a corner office. I will help you audit and rebuild this logistics network, but I'll do it as an independent consultant on my own schedule, 2 days a week. I need to make sure this world is actually ready for what I have to teach him before I dive all the way back in. Violet looked at him, the sudden realization hitting her that this man could never be bought, only earned. Levi tugged gently on Violet's silk sleeve, a knowing, mischievous smile on his small face. Don't worry, lady. That's just what my dad says when he actually means yes. Violet. A sudden breathless laugh escaped Violet's lips, a sound that felt completely foreign to her throat after 14 months of unyielding grief. She looked from the boy to Dominic, the intense, magnetic chemistry between them settling into something warm and real. 2 days a week it is, Mr. Cole, on your terms. Late that evening, long after the building had emptied and the rain had finally slowed to a gentle mist, Violet sat alone in her father's old leather chair. The massive penthouse office was dark, illuminated only by the amber glow of the city skyline below. On her desk sat the white bouquet, carefully transferred into a crystal vase by Hannah before she left. Violet unfolded the final page of her father's letter, her fingers tracing the faded ink of the postscript he had written in his final days. Violet, Charles had written, the white flowers are not a corporate token. They were your mother's absolute favorite before we lost her. I sent them to you every year not to force your forgiveness, but to remind you that love doesn't stop being real just because it becomes painful. You stopped accepting them because you couldn't see past the hurt. I only ask that you try to look closer. If Dominic Cole brought those flowers to you today, it means the day I feared most has arrived, and the company was in mortal danger. But it also means he is still, after all this time, the exact man of absolute integrity I knew he was. Trust him, Violet. You have spent too long trusting the wrong things. Let someone finally give you peace. A single, quiet tear slipped down Violet's cheek, catching the light of the city before it fell onto the paper. For the first time since her father's death, the crushing weight on her shoulders didn't feel so heavy. She looked across the room at the white petals, finally letting the old grief wash away, replaced by a sudden, blooming sense of hope. 3 months later, the Sterling Group was a completely different empire. The federal investigation, sparked by Dominic's decrypted files, had resulted in a sweeping indictment against Connor Blake and his conspirators at Arcturus Capital, entirely purging the executive ranks of the corruption that had threatened to destroy Charles Sterling's legacy. The whistleblower policies were entirely rewritten, ensuring no honest worker would ever be silenced again. Dominic's consulting rhythm had become the steady heartbeat of the operations department. 2 days a week, his rugged, grounded presence filled the fourth-floor offices. He wore his standard flannel shirts and clean jeans, completely indifferent to the corporate dress code, commanding more respect from the engineering teams than any suit-clad executive ever had. On school holidays, Levi sat in the corner of his office with a fresh sketch pad, his red toy car resting proudly on the mahogany desk like a permanent executive seal. In the height of spring, the clouds finally broke entirely, flooding the city with a brilliant, honest warmth. Violet had organized a private gathering on the building's ground floor terrace to dedicate a newly replanted garden in her father's memory. The border of the terrace was completely lined with dense, fragrant rows of pristine white blossoms. Violet stood by the stone fountain, wearing a soft, flowing dress that lacked any of the severe corporate armor she used to wear. When she saw Dominic and Levi walk onto the terrace, her entire posture softened. Levi was wearing a brand new button-down shirt that was slightly too big, his faded red toy car tucked securely into his front pocket. The boy walked right up to the central pedestal, where a fresh bouquet of white flowers sat tied with a familiar midnight blue silk ribbon. He looked up at Violet with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old. "Are you going to keep them this time?" Levi asked. Violet knelt down so she was at eye level with him, her eyes shining with a deep, unmistakable warmth as she glanced up at Dominic standing just behind his son. "Yes, Levi," Violet whispered, her voice thick with a beautiful shared emotion. "I'm keeping them forever this time." She reached down and took the small card tucked into the blue ribbon. It wasn't her father's handwriting this time. It was a simple, plain card written in Dominic's sharp, steady print. It read, "Kindness does not always arrive when we are ready, but when it is finally seen, it changes the shape of every room it enters." Violet stood back up, her eyes locking onto Dominic's steady gray gaze. The space between them was filled with the fragrant scent of spring and the quiet, unhurried certainty of a future they were building together, piece by piece. Levi tugged at his father's hand, entirely satisfied. "Can we get ice cream now, Dad? The sun is finally out." Dominic smiled, his strong hand squeezing his son's shoulder as he stepped closer to Violet, his shoulder brushing against hers in a silent, powerful promise of safety. "Yeah, buddy," Dominic said, his voice a warm, resonant anchor in the bright afternoon light. "The sun is finally out. Let's go."